To introduce our speaker this afternoon, I'm going to ask Dr. David Pilgrim to join us at the podium. A year ago, when Michigan was banning affirmative action, we knew that we had to do something different in our university, and what we did is we created the first chief diversity officer in the history of our institution, and we were fortunate to have an extraordinary person right at Ferris State University who could assume this role, and that's Dr. David Pilgrim. Later today, I believe you have the opportunity to go see the Jim Crow Museum, and if you have not had the opportunity to see the Jim Crow Museum, I would encourage you in the strongest way possible to see this. It will affect you. It will change the way that you think. And the visionary behind the Jim Crow Museum was Dr. David Pilgrim. He's also the person who's helped lead the charge for our university-wide diversity plan. Dr. Pilgrim.
Thank you, sir. Paul Loeb has spent over 30 years researching and writing about citizen responsibility and empowerment, asking what makes some people choose lives of social commitment while others abstain. He has written 5 widely praised books. You can see some on the table here. There'll be others available in the evening. He has lectured to enthusiastic responses at 400 colleges and universities around the country, including Harvard, Stanford, Dartmouth, Chicago, MIT, Yale, Cornell, Duke, Wisconsin, and that school in Ann Arbor. His January 2002 talk to the annual Provost Conference of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities inspired the association's American Democracy Project, which now involves 200 campuses. Born in California in 1952, Loeb attended Stanford University and New York's New School for Social Research and worked in both places to end the Vietnam War. He has written for a range of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times. His first book, Nuclear Culture, explored the daily world of atomic weapons workers in Hanford, Washington. Hope in Hard Times examined the lives and visions of ordinary Americans involved in grassroots peace activism. Generation at the Crossroads, Apathy in Action on American Campuses, explored the values and choices of American college students. Soul of a Citizen looks at what it takes to lead lives of social commitment despite all the obstacles, and now has 95,000 copies in print through 12 printings. His new anthology on political hope, which is called The Impossible Will Take a Little While, was published in 2004 by Basic Books and was named the #3 political book of the year by the History Channel and the American Book Association. I am one of the few sociologists who regularly quote H. Ross Perot, but here is a quote from him that rings true to me. The activist is not the one who says the river is dirty. The activist is the one who cleans the river. Paul Loeb has spent his life cleaning the river. Please help me welcome him. Thank you.
Well, when I say I'm very glad to be here, I mean this very literally in this case, because last night I was supposed to get a flight that was supposed to get in. I don't know if this is explained why we flipped the morning session, but it was supposed to get in originally at 8:30 to Grand Rapids, and it's a reasonable time frame. Then about a month later, they moved it to 9:30. That's still fine. And I get in with about 2.5 hours lead time, around 4 in the afternoon, and basically go over to the gate, everything's fine, go get a sandwich, and then about a half hour before it's supposed to leave, blink, it cancels completely. And I'm like, oh, what do I do? And I frantically called John Thorpe, and I'm not quite sure what to do. They say, oh, well, you're on a 10 o'clock flight, except it's not going out till 10:45. Well, at any rate, we ended up getting here at 3 in the morning in the Holiday Inn. So I was really grateful. And I don't know what it is. I love Michigan, but the last time I came for a Campus Compact thing, I got stuck in the Detroit airport for overnight. So I hope I'm not jinxing something, but but I did finally get a good night's sleep despite literally dreams of giving my talk without any pants and my tie wrapped around somebody's head. I'm not sure where that came from, but that was in my early morning dreams. So I then followed that with a really wonderful session this morning when actually I did get up with some sleep, and a conversation about the hard questions about, how do we bring other faculty into engagement? How do we get students coming from different backgrounds to recognize the common issues that we all face? And the questions, they don't necessarily have easy, as somebody said, magic bullet answers. What I want to try and do is just talk for a while and then open up to a conversation here, is explore a little bit, particularly around, I focus a lot on citizen participation, and I think that the theme of this conference of equity in the classroom and participation are very much joined at the hip, because if you look at how, if you look even at how the progress that we've made on our campuses in terms of diversity of faculty, in terms of diversity of students, it was driven time and time again by the actions of students who said, wait a moment, our campuses don't look like America, or our faculty don't look like America, or what are we doing for these communities that should be part of the university that aren't? So very much the sense of driving the need to tackle hard issues coming from then the participation. And I think what happens a lot of times for most students, though, is that, and this is true of students of varying backgrounds, that they aren't necessarily taught how to participate. I used to come up with the image, I'd say that they came up with a blank canvas, and now I call it a blank screen to be a little bit more up to date. But it's the same thing, which is if you say, do you envision yourself tackling one of the hard issues of your time? Then it's very difficult for them to do. They may think of themselves as volunteering, serving soup, being in a Big Brother project, something like that. But to actually say, how do you change an institution? Be it a campus, be it a state, be it a city, be it a nation, I think that often feels overwhelming. And so I'd argue that a lot of what our task is to be able to say, here are the models. Here are the varied kinds of ways that you can take stands, and to connect the dots on the issues themselves, but also on the ability to make change. And I was thinking about that. I don't know if folks remember. I guess it was in late 2005. The then Republican-dominated Congress cut about $13 billion it was $12.9 billion of financial aid for higher education, and they did it in a sort of rather slick way by backloading it largely on the cost of the student loan. So it wasn't like all of a sudden every student got a dramatic bill, but it meant that the already huge burden that so many students, particularly those from less affluent backgrounds, face going through schools, they just added another 50 pounds of weight onto their backs. And the interesting thing was, I was traveling around lecturing a lot, and I was asking students about it, and most of them didn't know about it. It was something that was very intimately affecting their lives in a kind of common choice. And they didn't have a sense, or for the few who did, they would say things like, well, I guess I'll just have to work harder over the summer or go further in debt, or, what can you do? And it struck me that, that one of the things that could have happened was that every campus could have said, this is a critical situation, a critical choice coming up, let us stop and look at it. But it didn't happen. The lobbying groups, the ACE and ASCU, and all those other groups were lobbying on the right side to try and stop those changes. And some of the student groups were trying to organize, but I didn't see this. For the degree to which it was going to affect students' lives, I didn't see that dialogue that said, look, here is a choice being made in your name, in our common name, that's going to affect you. And so, and even though students, as I said, they didn't know about that, but they all did know about Anna Nicole Smith and the astronaut in diapers and all those other juicy stories that dominate our media, while the really important questions are often on the back pages, if at all. So it started me thinking about, again, the relationship between individual choices and the common issues. And I remember there was a student, I ended up finishing school in New York City, and there was a student on the same block in Brooklyn who I ran into about 25 years later. And it was interesting because I'd gone to a private college and was able to finance it with 20 hours of work a week as a bartender making $5 an hour. And I could pay private college tuition and go out on the weekends and save a little bit of money and the rest of that. And here's a student 25 years later, he's making $6 an hour. He's commuting up to Harlem, an hour and a half each way from Brooklyn, working 30 hours a week at his job, dropping in and out of school because he didn't want to get too far behind in terms of debt. And I'm thinking, what's happened? This student is obviously working harder, if anything, than I had. But the rules have changed. A number of rules have changed, to be more precise. I mean, in the Reagan years, there was a shift in federal financial aid from grants to loans. So that previously, at a public school, basically his tuition would have been covered. Now it isn't. Now there's this gap. The minimum wage drops. It used to, when I was making my $5 an hour, it wasn't that much higher than the minimum wage, but it stagnated. It's now been raised to $7, but it stagnated for 30 years. And so students working low-end jobs found it harder and harder to go through school. The programs that once were there to make that easier had gotten cut. And so part of the lesson, and this is obviously not something you can address just on the level of a single state, but it seems to me that one of the things we need to be able to do when we're talking about access and equity is to get students thinking in those larger picture kinds of approaches, can get them connecting the dots. And some of them do, but again, it's remembering how precarious. I remember there was, I think this was the same visit, there were some tuition hikes and financial aid cuts at the CUNY system in New York, and there were some student sit-ins, and I was talking with a young woman who, she said, I'm working as a biscuit babe. She's making biscuits and chicken for minimum wage. She said, I just a young Latino woman. She said, I don't want to be a biscuit babe my whole life. That's why I'm going to college. I want to be able to, get some training, get some credentials. And she was getting ready to go off to her job, and all of a sudden she panicked. She said, oh my God, I lost my toothbrush. And I said, this was an urban campus in the middle of Manhattan. I said, oh, well, there's a drugstore up down the street. I just passed it, I'm sure they'd have one. And, I sort of blithely, not thinking. And she said, but I don't get paid till the end of the week. And it just struck me, because I'd been interviewing, and she'd been detailing every single, down to the penny, what she spent, because there was, I wasn't going out to clubs and buying fancy clothes or any of that. It was, and what I realized is, for her to have a toothbrush be lost, that was the level of disaster. And that, that there are students in our institutions who are in that situation. And so the question is, how then do we tackle talking about, issues like that in a way that everyone who's part of our institutions begins to comprehend that, and in a way that the political leaders who are making choices in our common name, in writing budgets in our common name, begin to comprehend that. Because one of the things that we do, I think, in our culture is that we push out the difficult questions. As this sort of came to me, I was in Indianapolis, it was about a year ago, and they had a big state historical museum, and I was kind of interested because, as you probably know, or may or may not know, Indiana was dominated by the Klan in the 1920s, and they basically ran the state. Elect senators, governors, they were the dominant power for about 8 years. And I was curious how this was going to be portrayed, because how do you deal with something so difficult? And I go in to this, huge block-long historical museum, and I'm wandering around, and finally I come to this little, I'm going to say literally from about here to here, exhibit. It was pretty damn small. And it shows, pictures of some people and some sheets. They're way at the back. There is a picture of a lynching. You can barely see it. And the main centerpiece of it is a newspaper article blasting the Klan. And there's sort of a caption that says, most of the media agreed with the Indianapolis Recorder, and these groups opposed the Klan. And you would have sort of thought, all of Indiana really didn't like the Klan. And then I started looking closer at this newspaper, and I thought, this is kind of odd, because every story there is about race. And I realized this is the black newspaper. This is not the the major, what is that, Indianapolis Star Tribune, I think that's, this is not the major newspaper at the time. This is the African-American newspaper. And somehow, but they never happen to mention that. And somehow the narrative becomes created that all the respectable people, of course, didn't like the Klan. It was just a bunch of ruffians, marginal types. And so, it was a reminder to me of how, should I say, how hesitant we are to deal with our hard questions. How thoroughly those levels of denial are woven into our culture. That they're just there. You can't quite deny it completely. You got something, but push it aside. Say it's marginal. Say it's irrelevant. Let's not deal with it, because these are hard questions to deal with. As we've seen in with recent weeks with Obama's powerful speech in response to which you actually saw them, were some pretty interesting sermons from Minister Wright, not just looking at the 30-second clip, but actually looking at the entire sermon in context. So what happens is, I think we bury the history, and most people don't know. We also do something, though, that's probably equally dangerous, which is we bury the history of change. And so if students want to know how to tackle any issues at all, whether it be access to education, oh dear. So I've got to hold it in my hand, or what about if but it doesn't, oh, I see. Well, okay. Okay, how's this? Oh, okay. Well, thank you for being proactive and letting me know. Okay, so this is fine then. Okay, yeah, because I tend to be a little soft-spoken, and if the mic isn't working, that's not a good thing. So what I was saying is that we bury the stories of change. And so if a student wants to take on an issue, whether it be financial aid or the Iraq War or, dealing with, the global warming, whatever it is, we don't give them the models. And the story that I mentioned in the earlier workshop that I always use as a kind of microcosm is the Rosa Parks story, because everybody thinks they know it. I mean, every seventh grader in America knows the name of Rosa Parks. But it came to me when I was on a CNN show that Parks was also on, and I was sitting in a studio in Atlanta, and she was coming in by remote from Detroit. And they introduced her, and what they said was, we're so proud to have Rosa Parks, which was fine, of course. One day, she refused to move to the back of the bus, and that started the civil rights movement. And I just started thinking, I got really upset. My section already concluded, so there wasn't anything that I could say. But and Parks chose not to. I'm not quite sure why. But that wasn't true. I mean, that Parks, in fact, was part of an already existing civil rights movement. She'd been an activist in the NAACP for a dozen years. She'd been the secretary of the local in Montgomery, Alabama. And you didn't have the network news cameras saying, she's making history, folks. She's taking minutes at a meeting, or she's making phone calls to get people to come to a meeting. But, those are the kinds of unappreciated, humble actions that do make history. And I started thinking about what I call the CNN version of history. And it's better than, God help us, the Fox version, which is not even on the same planet as reality. But it still leaves a lot to be desired. And so, what were the three elements conveyed by the CNN version of history? Here's this lone activist just completely acting on her own and changing things. Here's somebody acting kind of on a whim, her feet hurt. Here's somebody acting and things instantly change. None of that's true. She's part of a community. I mean, there was, for instance, a union organizer named E.D. Nixon, who was an activist with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that was founded by the legendary labor and civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph, who actually first came up with the idea of the March on Washington. And Nixon was the guy, for instance, who, right after Parks' arrest, and they were meeting with the African-American preachers, convinced a young and extremely hesitant Martin Luther King to get involved. And King was saying, I'm just starting, I'm new here, people don't really know me, let somebody else step forward. And Nixon was the person who said, no, you need to speak out. And that Montgomery, of course, was the context in which King blossomed as a global historical leader. There was a group of African-American women from a local women's college nearby who, if you remember the smelly purple ink of the mimeograph machines that preceded Xerox machines that ran off the flyers to hand out in the pews. So a whole community, which Parks herself, as a secretary of the NAACP, had built. And, if you think of the difference between the image of lone activist and a community engaged, very critical difference, because it tells people how history changes, how they act. Second, omission, the idea that it just sort of happened. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Jim Wallace, the wonderful minister from Sojourners, actually came out of Michigan, he says hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. So it's taking a leap of faith. You look at the horizon, it doesn't look like things can shift. You act, by your actions, they shift. And that's a critical part of social change. Right next to it, though, is intentionality, which is you look at a situation, you see what you want to shift, you figure out who your allies are, who the obstacles are, what story you want to tell, who should tell that story. It's about being deliberate and strategic. And when Parks went to training sessions at the Highlander Center, the Labor and Civil Rights Center, still going in Tennessee, that's what they were doing. They were strategizing. They were learning. There's a woman named Septima Clark, a former teacher from South Carolina, who became a mentor to her and other younger civil rights leaders like King. So they were connecting with the chain of already existing activism and trying to push it forward. And then, of course, the third element dropped out is the element of perseverance. Because if she gives up in year 3 or 5 or 7 or 10, we never hear of her. And so if I look at that and I think, what is the story about change that most students, most citizens know? It's the stripped down story. It's the lone hero on the pedestal story. It's the isolated individual story. It's not a community working and building change story. And so it leads people either to feel like they're inadequate to the task, because how could they be like Rosa Parks, or if they do start, not to know how to do it because they don't think in terms of enlisting other people. And I remember asking a student, what do you, I'll tell the Rosa Parks story, and literally maybe 10% of the students will know the real story. I'll ask them afterwards. I asked the student what they knew about social change activism in general, and they said, well, to be honest, we don't learn much. We learn a few facts, a few names, a few dates, a few figures. We learned that Lincoln freed the slaves and women got the vote and some unions were organized and Dr. King said, I have a dream, and people cheered him on, and somebody signed a civil rights bill, and that's about all we know. And I'd argue that all of that's gotten immeasurably worse with No Child Left Untested. Just, cracking the whip to just, this is on the test, this is on the test, and drive out the stories that could actually inspire people. And so in that context, it makes sense that students would come into our institutions not knowing how to act, not knowing how to take a stance, even on the issues that they care the most about. And so part of our challenge is that we've got to be able to give them the models. And that means, the historical models, connecting in the models that are out there in our communities of people working for change. It means being the models ourselves as well. I mean, they see us, it's not that we want to say, horrible pedagogy, agree with me, you get an A, disagree, you get an F. I mean, that's, we don't want to go, anywhere near that road. But it's saying, here I am, a human being who is trying to tackle some of these issues. I don't know all the answers. I may have a PhD, but I'm trying to tackle some of the difficult issues of our time. And I would encourage you to do the same, whether they're the same issues or on the same side of the issues or not, that's fine. But that task of being able to model, I think of my closest friends, commercial fisherman and environmental activist who also teaches at a community college, and his students, not as if it's the subject of his courses, but they know he's going down to an Endangered Species Act. He's testifying at a Port Commission hearing. They see a letter of his in the paper or hear an interview on the radio. They know he's engaged. And that does something, and very few of them are involved in the same particular issues as he is. But we'll go running together, and he'll show me the article from the local paper about some community group, and you say, that's one of my students. That's one of my former students who's doing this, because somehow they saw that sense of a model that allowed them to be able to act. I think that's really important. I think somehow we've also got to be able to challenge, and this is hard, the students who are resistant. I mean, I remember, and we do it by, well, how do we do it? They may come in saying, I quoted this in the last session, one student said, well, you make your own chances in this world. That's one of the myths of this culture. If you're on top, you deserve it. If you're on the bottom, you deserve it. Now, the student who said this came from a pretty affluent background, lived a pretty sheltered life, but hadn't been challenged. Another friend of his was saying pretty much equivalent or worse kinds of things, and he was saying, well, it's a wealthy Catholic school in Connecticut, and he was saying, we gave the blacks so much, why are they always complaining? And my goal is to make enough money so I can say, buddy, buzz off. Here's my house, my car, my boat, my airplane. Don't bother me. And, I would argue that this student was the product of that side of our culture, which is, pretty... Oh, moving again from the mic? Thanks. Okay. I don't know if holding... Maybe, should I hold it? Okay. Yeah. I think I'm used to a little bit broader spectrum mics that you don't have to be exactly behind them. So if I wave my hands too much and leave and the voice leaves, let me know. So basically what happened is this student was product of that highly individualist notion that just sort of says, here's things are, if you're on top, you must have deserved it. If you're on the bottom, well, you must have done something wrong. You know, it's a character flaw. And yet what happened is it was a sort of, I guess not your conventional track, but he was pre-med because his dad was a wealthy doctor. And one of his professors started talking about environmental issues, including some environmental justice issues. And he resisted at first. And he said, we were very upset this was not going to be on our pre-med exams. Why was he wasting our time? And then he said, then I got it. He wasn't wasting our time. This was reality, and we had to deal with it. And the student ended up switching his major, going into environmental remediation. And when I going into that as a career even, when I talked to him last, he said, you know, I can't believe I said those appalling things as a freshman. And I said, well, they were pretty terrible, I have to admit. Although, you know, I also have to say there's other students who said similar things. It's part of our culture. He said, but you know, I said, you should feel good because you're not there now. He said, no, I'm not. I've learned a lot. I think I'm a little bit humbler. And he said, you know, I wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that professor taking that risk. And, you know, it stuck in my mind because part of that challenge is, in creating that inclusive community, how do you challenge those students who are resistant? And I think the answer is you do it. You do it and you listen. I remember a friend of mine she was actually originally from Kenya and then immigrated here after the dictatorship, basically kind of had to flee for her life as a sociologist. And she was teaching at a school in California, and some of the students said, they were talking about racial profiling, and they were just completely in denial. Or, you know, these are cops who are just doing their jobs, doesn't exist, isn't a problem. And she said, well, can you talk with me? You know, can you come and talk with me afterwards? I really want to try and explain this and explore it a little bit more. And they came and she said, you know, if I had your background, I probably would have the same response. If I'd gone through your experiences, I probably would have had the same response. I mean, you know, we're often bound by our experience. I think that's part of what Obama was referring to when he was talking about his grandmother, who he dearly loved, being at some point bound by her experiences. And she said, but you know, try and talk with some people who have had some different experiences. And the interesting thing is the students took the risk of doing that, and both of them ended up writing their senior thesis about issues surrounding racial profiling. You know, not every student's going to respond. But it was interesting to me that, and it took, I mean, I don't know, it took in her case, I guess, maybe more patience than I would have had, because they were saying things, that just did not correspond with reality. But they were saying things that were coming out of their experience, and somehow she got them to reflect on that experience as a blinder, and then to be able to begin to get past it. I think that's part of how that can happen. Part of it, getting students off the campuses. A friend of mine in Buffalo teaches chemistry, and Buffalo, as you probably know, has horrible air quality issues because of the chemical plants. It's where Love Canal was. And he ended up having his students distribute these pocket air quality monitors so that the people in low-income neighborhoods could know whether there were toxic substances in the air and organize around trying to do something about it. And he was driving along the sort of poorest neighborhoods in Buffalo, and the poorest neighborhoods in Buffalo look like the poorest neighborhoods in Detroit. They're pretty bleak in some ways. And he saw all these young men and women hanging on the corner with the pocket air quality monitors dangling from their shirts. And it was an amazing moment for him because he realized that community was beginning to get some tools to take control of its own future, in that absolutely important issue of their own health, and that his students were in dialogue, and that there was learning going on both sides. So, part of the challenge is how do you get those stories to the students? How do you get the students to the stories? Part of it is getting them off beyond the bounds of the campus. Part of it is encouraging, and this is hard, people in the classroom, the students, to claim their own voice, to claim the knowledge that they have. I remember I mentioned earlier I was at Northern Michigan University about a year and a half ago, and there was a conversation in one of the classrooms, and one of the students, this pretty sheltered, I think from a fairly affluent white background, said something very just cavalier about crime and locking people up and throwing away the key. And an African-American student in the classroom, who came from a pretty poor neighborhood, I think in Detroit, said, well, it's a little more complicated. And just told a story about her family and her brother and some of the things that he'd experienced. And you could see in that classroom this shift going on of recognition that maybe some of the ways that some of the students thought the world was ordered weren't quite commensurate to reality. That this learning was happening. And the student was talking about something very difficult, in this case, quite personal. But yet, as she was doing that, she was teaching other students. And I think she was also recognizing that she had some very powerful things to say that were important. A lot of times that we're taught in this culture, and I at first thought this was just true of students, but I don't think it is, that to be able to speak out on an issue, we need to know certain arcane information, every 17th decimal point statistic, every fact, every detail. We have to answer every conceivable question. We have to be as eloquent as King and saintly as Gandhi and on and on and on and on in a way that no human ever is. And I call it the perfect standard, this trap that people get caught in. And yet what I realized is that to get past it, you have to jump in. I think about, there's a woman I write about in my Soul of a Citizen book named Virginia Ramirez, who lives in San Antonio, who dropped out of school with an 8th grade education, got married, got pregnant, raised her kids, husband drove a taxi, not very politically involved. And one day an old woman in her neighborhood died of the cold because her house was so run down. And Virginia goes to a meeting of a community group to try and do something about it. And they ask her to get involved, and she's extremely hesitant. She basically just have a house meeting with her neighbors. And the day comes, and she's so terrified, she literally cannot open the door. So the people knocking on the door, and she's standing there thinking, but what if I say the wrong thing? What if somebody asks me a question I don't have the answer for? What if I have to say I don't know? Just paralyzed. And then finally, after about 6 or 7 minutes, she realized she couldn't, just be rude and keep them outside. So she opens the door. They come in. They start talking about their neighborhood, what they want to be able to achieve in it. And she gets involved step by step. But there's still fear. And the first time she goes to a San Antonio City Council meeting, she said, I was so terrified that not only did I forget my speech, I forgot my name. I just went blank. And all I could think of is, who am I to tell city council people what to do? I just have an 8th grade education. And it's interesting because, she eventually went back to a 2-year college, got her associate's degree, became a kind of major community leader, ended up at one point testifying before committees of the United States Senate and Congress. And I asked her, I said, weren't you nervous? These are United States senators. And she said, well, I was a little bit nervous. I prayed to God the night before I wouldn't make a complete fool and a jackass out of myself. But to be honest, I was so much more scared that first time I talked to my neighbors. I was so much more scared the first time I talked to the San Antonio City Council. By the time I got to the U.S. Senate, I was used to it. And I think that's a very important notion because, think about our students. Who's more intimidating? A U.S. senator or their neighbor down the hall or the person in the class? I would suggest that if they haven't spoken out, it may be that person sitting in the class next to them, or it may be that person down the hall. That threshold of claiming your voice, particularly in talking about any kind of difficult, loaded issue, is just so hard. So somehow, part of what we've got to be able to do is to say, no, it isn't about perfection. It isn't about having all the answers. It isn't about having all the confidence. I love a story that Gandhi's grandson tells about him, Arun Gandhi, about how he was, basically Gandhi's family mortgaged everything they had to send him to law school. Their land, their jewelry, anything worth anything they borrowed on. And he came out and he was so painfully shy that he would get up in court and he would stammer and stammer and stammer and literally not get a word out and lost every case he had. He was just this utter failure as a lawyer. And so his family didn't know what to do, and they sent him off to South Africa, hoping that something would change, which of course it did. And I like that because, here's Gandhi not as this master strategist of social change, this truly global historical figure, but as somebody who's so intimidated he literally cannot speak. So part of our challenge, I think, is being able to give the support to our students to be able to speak and for them to recognize, particularly the students for whom the higher education is foreign turf, that they, in their knowledge and their experience, that they have tremendous resources to bring, to contribute, that may not be the resources normally valued and validated in the currency of higher education, but are equally powerful and equally essential to the dialogue. So that, to me, that's part of the challenge. So it's about challenging those students to go past their boundaries. It's supporting students to be able to recognize, just to say someone like Virginia Ramirez ended up recognizing the power of her own experience and all the things that she did know, even if she just started with an 8th grade education, and to be able to have them tackle the hard issues and again, draw the links. I'm thinking, I'm coming here thinking about Michigan and the battered economy and that you folks have had for a while, and then looking at the, the recent figures of God knows what kind of economic period, we're heading into. And then you read the Nobel Prize winners, Joseph Stiglitz, talking about the $3 trillion war by the time all the, delayed costs of, healing the vets and paying for their long-term care, and everything comes into account. And you think, well, what could those resources go to towards supporting education and access to education and investing, in shifting this economy over to make it, vital and powerful again? It's these questions that seem distant, they hit home. Sometimes they hit home immediately. I remember on the eve of the war being at Saginaw State. Eve meaning like literally 3 days before. And it was interesting. I asked how many people knew somebody who were, over there about to serve, and 85% of them did. And then I went to a very, very nice, good private college by Cleveland. Not a single person knew somebody. It just was the starkest contrast between who was serving and who wasn't serving. So you look at that, and somehow we've got to find ways to talk about those issues on the campuses, because that's who's paying the brunt of it. We've got to talk when they had $120 billion of tax cuts, the wealthiest, tiniest bracket. People, what could that be? What investments could that be funding? I remember reading about a story about Paul Allen is the co-founder of Microsoft, and there was a story about his second yacht. Like my other car is a Cadillac. This is his smaller yacht, which had like 40-person staff and 2 helicopters and a submarine and 7 other boats on board. And I was just on, and full Olympic-sized swimming pool, all this stuff. I was like, wow, what's his real yacht like? And well. It had 60 people and 7 Navy SEALs in case of pirates, and 3 submarines, and on and on and on and on. And the maintenance on it was a $200 million yacht with $20 million a year of maintenance. And I'm thinking, we are making decisions in this society to privilege the people to buy. And he also had 2 other yachts and 2 Boeing 757s in case one was in the shop. And, I'm just thinking he can only be, I don't begrudge him some toys, but he can only be on any one of these nice things at any one time. So, when there's a debate in the Senate about tax policy, it affects the students here. It affects their ability to go to school, and it affects the kinds of jobs they're going to have when they're going out. I did an environmental sustainability tour of Copenhagen and the adjacent Swedish city of Malmö, and I saw, globalization affects, Europe as well, and there was a huge shipyard that was Malmö Central Industry that shut down in the face of South Korean competition. What's interesting is part of what's now going on there is there's a wind turbine factory, and I saw this huge hangar that used to be made, not hangar, I guess hangar would be the word, used to be making hulls of ships. And inside now, the steel the machines that bent the steel for the ship hulls are now bending them into wind turbine towers. And the huge machine, cranes that go across the ceiling that used to be carrying pieces of ships are now carrying the pieces of wind turbines. And of course, the people who used to be making the ships are now wind turbine towers. And I saw that, and I saw there was a Danish, it was a farm equipment company, not a particularly big one, called Vestas, that because the government said we will buy renewable energy, wind power at a certain price that made it competitive, Vestas is now the largest wind turbine producer in the entire world, and it's the largest export engine of the Danish economy. And I thought, you can do that. You can do that in a place like Michigan. You can do that with the skills that still exist, around the automobile industry. You can do that with the physical plants that still exist. But you do have to have the debates, and you do have to say, all right, the kind of production that was occurring is going to have to shift. And so, it still could be cars, but it's going to have to be different kinds of cars. Students have to be involved in those debates, because otherwise what's going to happen is there will be either we'll just destroy ourselves with global warming, or there will be this new green economy, and it will all be centered in Europe and Japan and China and India. And what better place to have those kinds of discussions, because they're about that economic base that makes equity possible, to bring them into our classrooms. And I'm not suggesting that they have easy answers, but that they've got to be a starting place to say, all right, here is where the future of this global economic enterprise is going to be going. How are we going to play a role? How are we going to get the resources to make the investments, to make the transitions, to be able to produce those products? Because the people skills are still here. And again, some of the plants have been dismantled and shipped to China, but a lot of the physical plant is still around. How do you then make those decisions to actually do that and have it to be debated out in the classrooms? To me, that just seems like a critical choice, and it has to be addressed by common action. One of the traps, I think, is the notion that hard questions can be addressed by, quote, points of light. It's not true. Those Big Brother programs are great, and the mentoring programs are great, and the students working at food banks are great, but it ends up often like, there was, granted a student more privilege, it was a Stanford student who said very well-meaningly, I've learned so much volunteering at this homeless shelter. I hope my grandchildren get the opportunity to volunteer at the same shelter that I have. And as his friends pointed out, that's not where you want to go. So somehow, whether people are coming from those communities or coming from more sheltered communities, we've got to be able to take those difficult issues back into the classrooms and talk about, what does it mean to create a more just world. And again, this isn't just there's a sort of notion sometimes that says, oh, this is a task, the students at that school in Ann Arbor, they can handle that kind of stuff. They can take care of it. No, the more beleaguered the communities that people come from, the more urgency there is for them to take on those tasks. Because ultimately, they're going to have to be the people who are the spokespeople and the bridge builders and the coalition builders who help give their communities a voice. And we've got to teach them the skills to do that. Because otherwise, it's just going to be that much harder for the communities to be able to do anything. So again, it means teaching them to speak, bringing hard issues, linking hard issues. And it was interesting, I went to it was a 6,000 student global warming conference called Power Shift. And this is last November. And amazing group of students. Pelosi was speaking. I was one of the speakers on the stage. And the closing speaker is somebody named Van Jones, who, if you ever have a chance to hear, is just absolutely amazing. He runs something called the Ella Baker Center out of Oakland, and was working a lot on prison issues and just the appalling, the way that our country has of imprisoning more people than any other nation in the world, particularly, certainly more African American and Latino people. And he started working on what he calls green jobs. And the idea that you actually, if you're going to make investments on this necessary transition we're going to have to make in the economy, a lot of them involve things that can't be outsourced. Insulating houses and installing solar panels and wind turbines. That all of these things They need people on the ground, and then you can train people from the very poorest communities to do that and give them decent jobs and tracks to union wages and all the rest of that. And he had a bunch of students from the South Bronx up on stage behind him with this big kind of banners that said solar cells, not jail cells. And what was interesting is got a tremendous response from the students there. And I saw these movements beginning to converge. And it's hard because they all have, historical barriers. But just beginning to come together in a way that gave me hope. I see a lot of, we often talk about youth disengagement, but I see some hopeful shifts. If we looked at the 2006 election, it was a kind of interesting watershed because 18 to 29-year-olds really were the candidates that swung it. Not the candidates, the voters. And if you looked at that election as a mandate, essentially a vote on where we've been in the last 7 years. So to vote Democratic in that case was a kind of yearning for change, and to vote Republican was saying things are going where they have been, and that's fine. That nationally it was 60% to 38% among young voters. That's pretty stunning. And there are 4 races, Senate races, that shifted that if it wasn't for young voters wouldn't have shifted. If it had only been up to young voters, 4 more would have shifted. Same thing was true in congressional races. So you saw this upswelling of young voters wanting change, wanting to participate. I've seen that. I know that, Michigan's had this unfortunate series of decisions by some people I actually think are pretty good people who just made some mistakes, that landed you in this gridlock in the Democratic primary. But if I look all over at the young people flooding into the Obama campaign in particular, it's astounding. You are talking about new participation. And one of the interesting things that, those of you with any political science background know that, once people begin to participate early on, much, much greater chance that they're going to do so throughout their whole lives. So what you're seeing is suddenly these huge teachable moments where there's this yearning, and all of a sudden you see all these young men and women flooding in, wanting to act, wanting to change, with their spirits soaring a little bit, thinking something might be possible. And I don't think it's all sort of airy-fairy talk. I think that this comes out of some real community organizing lessons in Obama's case about how you actually make people in a very, very bleak situation like the places he was working in the south side of Chicago have a sense of hope, find a way out of no way. And I think that we ought to be able to take advantage of that, whatever our political backgrounds, of that interest, of that yearning to say, yeah, this is a time when you actually can make a difference. And then I think we also need to take and give them a sense of the power of human actions and how change does occur. And it's interesting, I was thinking a lot, one of the areas I wrote about in the last book was, when I'm looking at change, is how do you look at people in the most difficult situations? So you look at Mandela in jail in Robben Island for 27 years, and he assumes that when he gets in that he's going to get out. Something will happen, something will shift. But then 3 years goes by, 5 years, 7, 10. How do you avoid believing what you're told, which is you will never leave here alive? Talk about a situation without hope. Well, you do so, at least in his explanation, by finding ways to act, even in situations that seem impossible. So the guards they're denying you newspapers to isolate you. And you see a guard's sandwich wrapped in a newspaper, and he throws the sandwich in the trash. And you pull out a sandwich wrapper, and you see a story that might inspire people. And in a tiny script, coded script, on a piece of toilet paper, you pass the story, the headline, "Sell to sell to sell," to remind the people that they aren't alone. So it's that community, that sense of community. Or you're breaking rocks in a courtyard, and you start whistling a freedom song. So it's those ways that, even in the most difficult circumstances. I saw that in some of the people struggling on the Eastern European dictatorships, like Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia, was one of the leaders of their freedom movement. And he was describing a moment where he was circulating a petition to free some political prisoners. And everyone was mocking him. This is not going to make any difference. Not going to, they're not going to listen. And we're all, we've heard those phrases. I've heard those phrases in the U.S. I call the global fraternity the cynical and contemptuous, looking down at us. what you do is not going to matter. I mean, I doubt that there's a single person in this room who hasn't heard some variant of that. And Havel's looking back about 7 years later, and he says, we actually didn't free the prisoners that time, so you could say the critics were right, but I think they weren't. One, they said that because of our actions, they were able to keep going. They knew they weren't alone. Same idea as as a Nelson Mandela argument. Second, he said, when they started there, that was their first step, to sign the petitions. That wasn't their last step. They went on to play dissident music, put on dissident plays, preach from the pulpit, speak out in the classrooms, challenge this regime in 100 different ways, and there are now so many people speaking out they can't put us all in jail. And he had absolute faith that that would turn things. And 3 years later, after he wrote those words, there was a nonviolent revolution in 1989 all across Eastern Europe, and indeed they prevailed. And so I was thinking, well, what's the lesson? The lesson to me is that you're doing two things when you're working for change. And we've got to teach us to our students and remind ourselves. One is you're trying to achieve an immediate goal. We're trying to move forward a critical program on campus. We're trying to get some resources for students who can't afford to go to school. We're trying to stop a war, win an election. I mean, lives can hinge on the success or failure of our immediate efforts. But that's all that's going on. Because we're also doing something else. We're trying to draw people into a stream of involvement. And sometimes, even if you failed the first task, you can succeed at the second. So that's what happened in Czechoslovakia. They signed this petition to free these prisoners. The prisoners didn't get freed, but because they signed the petition, a bunch of other things happened. A bunch of other people became involved, and eventually they overthrew the dictatorship. Same thing, you look at the Rosa Parks story. You ask the question, who got Rosa Parks involved? Well, we know that her husband, Raymond Parks, was a barber who was one of the co-founders of the Montgomery NAACP. So he plays a key role. But who got Raymond Parks involved? I don't know. It's not in anything that I've read. But you have to assume that there was a series of conversations, possibly in the barber shop, because that's one place that people talk, about what was going on and the need to challenge it and the difficulty of challenging it and the fear because they're taking on issues like lynching. And among those conversations, their cumulative weight triggered Raymond Parks to get involved. And then when he meets Rosa, she gets involved. And then a dozen years later comes an action that everybody would acknowledge as making global history. And so I would say that if we're not for these people whose names we're never going to know, you might not have Rosa Parks on the bus. And I think that's a powerful lesson because we can look at our students in our classrooms and we could say, we don't know who's going to be out there. I mean, I remember hearing Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya, speaking, describing being in this little college in Atchison, Kansas, and Benedictine College, I think it was called, and the social justice conversations impel her to go back and launch this Greenbelt movement and eventually challenge the regime and win the Nobel Peace Prize. And, maybe there's a Wangari Maathai sitting in our classroom. I mean, more likely it's not going to be somebody who wins a Nobel Peace Prize. But it could be somebody who goes on to do all sorts of powerful things. It could be lots of somebodies. And I think that's part of that challenge that we have to have is to remember how to teach our students that even if they try something, can we convince our students that they could be part of that river and join us in being part of that river? It seems to me that that's a critically important role that we can play. And then finally, one other thought in terms of what to teach them and what to remind ourselves is that they've got to savor the process because, we're asking our students, we're asking our colleagues, we're asking ourselves to take on really difficult issues. And so the question is this just going to be grim work? I don't think so. And I was thinking about Tutu and his lesson and example. And I've heard him 3 times now, and it's been amazingly powerful experience each time. And first I just thought about his life and just the number of difficult things he's taken on. I mean, starting with being a black man in apartheid South Africa, and having to tell his children, you cannot go to this beach or this park or this part of town, and seeing friends imprisoned and murdered and tortured. I mean, harsh situation. And then chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and being that sort of spiritual hub that everybody is relying on to get them through day after testimony about the most horrible things. And who does Tutu have to lean on? You know, so he's, you know, where does he get his resources of strength? And then certainly not being silent since then. I mean, speaking out passionately about the Iraq war before and since, being in Rwanda trying to bring healing to that scarred land. There was recently an election in Haiti that they tried to steal, and he was in there as an election observer, and there were riots, and they brought in helicopters to fly out the election observers, and Tutu said, my job is to stay here with the people here and help cool things out in terms of rioting, but, you know, continue the protests to get the person they'd elected. I mean, always throwing himself into the difficult issues. I mean, he recently said about global warming, there's 2 billion, or maybe there's 3 billion reasons to act on global warming, meaning the poorest people in the world who are going to suffer the brunt of it. And so you think about that, and you think, after at some point, wouldn't he just become embittered? Wouldn't he have seen too much human destructiveness and callousness? And yet, if you have the chance to see him, it's exactly that opposite feeling. I mean, he almost, I don't know how to describe it, except he almost floats off the stage. I mean, he's joking, he's teasing, he's just having a good time. And I remember there was one phrase that repeated each of the 3 times I've heard him, and he would say, God has a sense of humor, and he would tell some kind of silly joke. And the one that stuck in my mind, he said, who would think that the world would learn anything from South Africa? We're not the brightest country. Our scientists decided they would build a rocket to the sun, and when people pointed out that it would burn up, they said, don't worry, we will launch it at night, it will be fine. And I'm sitting there, you know, I was sitting there laughing, and then he goes from there into talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm thinking, you know, Tutu has this amazing lifetime. Why is he spending this, whatever it was, to tell a fairly silly joke? And I'm thinking, I get it. He's reminding us to laugh. You know, that's as important as any of the, you know, thousands of stories he could tell about the struggle against apartheid. That's as important. And it, you know, and it clicked, and I got it. And then the other moment that I got was the first time I saw him. It was a benefit for a South African project in Los Angeles, and he's been battling prostate cancer, so he's not always feeling too well. In fact, was not feeling well that night. Lay down for a nap beforehand. Got up, gave his talk. Some other people spoke. And some music starts playing, this great band from East LA, and people start dancing. And I look over, there's Desmond Tutu just dancing away, and I'm thinking, I've never seen a Nobel Peace Prize winner dance before, much less an archbishop. This is really interesting. And the lesson that I got at that point is, you have to savor the gifts of the world. The Tutu savoring what he calls the grace of the world is absolutely inseparable from his radical prophetic voice for justice. They're one and the same. And that if we can learn that, and if we can impart that to our students, there's no telling what we can shift. Thanks.